A bony hand shot out from under the quilt and clamped down on a wrist. The grip was hard, harder than any dying woman should have been able to manage. A kerosene lamp flickered on the night table. Rain hammered the tin roof above. The old woman pulled the younger one close until their foreheads almost touched. Her breath smelled of iron and pine tar. "Burn the smokehouse," she whispered. "Burn it tonight before the sun comes up. Burn it down to the dirt and salt the ground." The younger woman tried to pull back. The grip tightened. A single tear cut a clean line through the soot on the old woman's cheek. "Promise me," she said. "Promise me you will not look inside." Why would a dying mother beg her disowned daughter to destroy the one building she had guarded for 40 years? "Stay with me on this one." 23 years before that bedroom, a screen door slammed on the front porch of a faded white farmhouse. A suitcase landed in the gravel. A 19-year-old girl in a thin cotton dress picked it up without crying. Behind her, a tall man with a leather belt in his hand stood in the doorway. Behind him, a woman in an apron stared at the floor and would not lift her eyes. The girl walked down the long dirt road that led off the holler. She did not turn around. She did not say goodbye. The reason she had been thrown out was simple enough on the surface. She had refused to marry the neighbor's son. The neighbor's son was 26. He had hands like shovels and a temper that had already put one girl in the county hospital. The match had been made over a handshake and a bottle of bourbon when she was 14 years old. Nobody had asked her then. Nobody was asking her now. They were telling her. She had said no in the kitchen, calm and clear, and her father had risen from his chair so fast it tipped over backward. That girl was Maeve Holloway. The holler was a steep little fold in the Appalachian Mountains, where the same 6 family names had been carved into the church wall for 200 years. Holloway was one of them. So was Renfro. So was Coombs. So was the name of the neighbor's son, whose father owned the land that ran right up to the Holloway Smokehouse. Out in the wider world, Maeve had done what cast-off mountain girls were supposed to do, and what they were never supposed to do. She had worked diner shifts at a truck stop outside Knoxville for 2 years. She had slept in the back room above the kitchen. She had been hit on by long-haul drivers and learned, very fast, how to say no in a way that did not get her fired. She had sold encyclopedias door to door for one terrible summer. She had eventually gone to community college on a grant for displaced women. She had transferred to a state school. She had worked the night desk at a motel to pay for it. She had become a paralegal in a small city 300 miles from the holler. She had married a kind man who fixed engines for a living and never once raised his voice at her in 9 years of marriage. She had buried him too young. She had not raised children. She had raised herself. In all those years, the only piece of mail she had ever gotten from the holler was a Christmas card from her grandmother. The card always had a $5 bill folded inside it and a single line in pencil on the back. "Be well, child." After her grandmother died, even that stopped. Then one afternoon, a letter arrived in a long cream envelope. The return address was a law office in the county seat. Maeve sat at her kitchen table for a long time before she opened it. The letter was 3 short paragraphs. Her mother, Hester Holloway, was dying. Cancer. The lawyer had been instructed to find her. Her mother was asking for her by name. Her father had died 8 years earlier, and nobody had told her. The lawyer was sorry about that. Maeve read the letter twice. She made a pot of coffee. She did not drink it. She packed one bag and pointed her old sedan east toward the mountains. The road into the holler had not changed. The same kudzu was still eating the same telephone poles. The same Pentecostal church still leaned on the same hillside. The same hand-painted sign still read "No trespassing" in white letters that ran out of paint halfway through. The same one-lane bridge still rattled when she crossed it. The same little post office still had its flag at half-mast, though Maeve could not have said for whom. The farmhouse, when she pulled up in front of it, looked smaller than she remembered. Smaller and tireder. The white paint was gray. The front porch sagged in the middle like a broken back. A wreath of dried laurel hung on the door, the way it always had in November, even though it was May. Behind the house, set apart in a small clearing of bare red dirt, stood the smokehouse. Squat, black with 40 years of creosote. The padlock on its door was the only thing on the whole property that looked new. A neighbor met her on the porch before she even knocked. He was an old man now, with a face like a folded paper bag and eyes she still recognized. Asa Renfro, the man who had stood beside her father at the church door every Sunday of her childhood. He took her hand in both of his. He told her he was sorry. He told her her mother had been waiting. He told her quietly that he had heard about the marriage that never happened, and that he wanted her to know he had spoken against it at the time. Maeve thanked him. She watched his eyes. She had been around enough courtrooms to know what a careful sentence sounded like. Sa Renfro was being very careful. Inside, the house smelled of camphor and old fires. A hospice nurse moved aside in the narrow hallway. The bedroom door was open. There in the bed she had been born in lay her mother. Hester Holloway was a yellow stick of a woman now. Her hair was thin as cobweb on the pillow. Her eyes were still the bright shocked blue of mountain ice. They locked onto Maeve the second she stepped into the room and did not let go. The hospice nurse, sensing something, set a glass of water on the table and slipped out. Maeve sat down on the edge of the bed. For a long time neither of them spoke. Then the bony hand came out from under the quilt and clamped down on her wrist, and the dying woman pulled her close and asked the impossible thing. Burn the smokehouse. Tonight. Before sunrise. Do not look inside. Do not open the floor. Do not read anything you find. Just burn it. Burn it the way your grandmother should have burned it the day she built it. Promise me. Maeve, with her wrist going numb in her dying mother's grip, promised. She did not yet know what she was promising. Outside, the rain stopped, and a slow gray dusk settled over the holler. Inside, her mother closed her eyes and her breathing eased, and the hospice nurse, on hearing the change, came back in and quietly said it would not be long now. By full dark, Hester Holloway was gone. Maeve sat on the porch for a long time after the funeral home van pulled away. The holler was very quiet. Crickets, a whippoorwill, a single dog barking 3 ridges over. She thought she would feel something dramatic. She did not. She felt tired. She felt 42 years old. She walked across the dirt yard toward the smokehouse. The padlock gleamed in the porch light. The key was on a thin chain around her own neck now, where the hospice nurse, following whispered instructions, had hung it. Maeve told herself she was only going to look at the lock. She was not going to open it. She was going to keep her promise. She stood in front of the door for a long minute. Then she turned around and walked back to the house. 2 hours later, she could not sleep. She could not stop hearing her mother's voice. Burn it down to the dirt. She got up. She put on her coat. She picked up the gas can from the porch where her father had always kept it, the one her mother had refilled, the nurse said, only 2 days ago. She walked back to the smokehouse. The night was warm and still. The crickets had quit. Even the whippoorwill had quit. Maeve stood there with the gas can in one hand and the key in the other, and for the first time since she had been thrown out of this place at 19, she was afraid. She did not pour the gas. She told herself she would. She told herself she just wanted to see what her mother had been so afraid of. She fit the key into the padlock. The lock opened so easily it was as if it had been waiting. She set the gas can down. She pushed the heavy door inward on its iron hinges. The smell that rolled out of the smokehouse was not the smell of hams and hickory smoke. It was the smell of cedar and old paper and something faintly chemical, like darkroom developer. She lit a small camp lantern she had brought from the car. The room was empty. No hooks. No salt boxes. No racks. Just a packed dirt floor, swept clean, and 4 whitewashed walls. In the center of the floor was a square braided rug. It was a strange thing to find in a smokehouse. Maeve crouched down and lifted one corner of the rug. Under the rug was a wooden trapdoor with a heavy iron ring. The trapdoor had been used. The edges were worn smooth. The hinges had been oiled recently. Maeve let the corner of the rug fall back. She stood up. She walked outside. She closed the door behind her. She stood in the yard with her hands on her knees, and she breathed like a person who has just run a long way. Then she turned around. She went back inside. She lifted the rug. She pulled the iron ring. The trapdoor came up easily, balanced on a counterweight her grandfather had built into the frame. A wooden stair led down into the dark. The air that came up out of the hole was cool and dry and smelled of cedar shavings. Maeve sat in the open trapdoor for what felt like a long time. She could still leave. She could still pour the gasoline. She could still strike the match. She would never know. Whatever her mother had been protecting could go into smoke with the building, the way the dying woman had wanted. The promise would be kept. The daughter would be obedient. For the first time, she thought about the screen door slamming. She thought about the suitcase in the gravel. She thought about her father's tipped-over chair. She thought about a 14-year-old girl whose marriage had been arranged over bourbon. She thought, very calmly, that obedience had never been a thing this family had earned from her. She set the lantern down beside the trapdoor and started down the stairs. Above ground, far up the ridge, a single light came on in a window that should have been dark. A Sarenfro, who had been told by the hospice nurse that Maeve had received the key, was watching the smokehouse. He had been watching it, in one way or another, for 40 years. When he saw the light go down into the cellar, he reached for the telephone on his nightstand. The line was already open. Another voice was already on it. They had been waiting. Now they began to make calls. The cellar was small, maybe 8 feet by 8 feet. The walls were lined with cedar planks. The floor was poured concrete, which was strange for the holler, where most cellars were stamped dirt. Along 3 walls ran shelves. The shelves were full of journals. Not a few. Dozens. They were leather-bound, oxblood and forest green and the dull black of old hymnals. Each spine was hand-lettered with a year. The earliest one Maeve could see read 1947. The latest read this year. Her mother had been writing in one of these books 2 months ago. Maeve took down the 1947 journal first, because that was the year her grandmother had married. She sat on the bottom step and opened it. The handwriting inside was not her grandmother's neat schoolteacher hand. It was a man's hand, slanted hard to the right, written in fountain pen. The first page bore a name. The name was not Holloway. The name was a name Maeve did not recognize at all. Underneath it was a date and a notation. The notation read, in plain English, "Account of the man buried under the smokehouse floor." Maeve looked up from the page. She looked at the concrete under her feet. She set the journal carefully aside. She picked up the next one. And the next. And the next. Hours went past. She did not notice. The cellar had a smell of dry paper and old ink, and the faint chemical bite she had caught at the door, which she now recognized as the photo fixer her grandmother had used in the spare room when Maeve was a child. There were photographs tucked between pages. Black and white, then color, then the cheap drugstore prints of the 80s and 90s. There were maps drawn in pencil. There were lists of names in columns. Some of the names were crossed out. Beside each crossed-out name was a year. The years went all the way back to the 1930s. The journals were a ledger. The holler had been running a ledger. And somewhere in the second journal Maeve picked up, written in her grandmother's tight little script, was a single sentence that stopped her hand on the page. The sentence read, "The girl is not Eldon's. The girl is his." Eldon was her father's name. The girl, the date told her, was Maeve. The sentence had been written the year she was born. Outside, somewhere up the ridge, a truck door closed softly. Then another. Then another. "If you have made it this far with me, I want to ask one small thing before we go any deeper. If you have ever felt like the people who raised you were keeping something back, hit that subscribe button right now. It costs you nothing. It tells me to keep digging up stories like this one. Now back to the cellar. The man whose handwriting filled the 1947 journal had been a circuit preacher named Calder Wynn. He was not from the holler. He had come down from West Virginia on a borrowed mule in the summer of 1946 to hold a tent revival in the field behind the Holloway barn. He had stayed. He had stayed for 3 years. The journals, in his slanted hand, described a small, frightened community that had asked him to help them with what they called the trouble at the orchard. The trouble at the orchard, as Maeve read on, had been a man. A foreman from the timber company that owned the next ridge. The foreman had hurt a Renfro girl. He had hurt her badly. The sheriff at the time had been the timber company's cousin. The holler had decided, in a long meeting in the church basement, that the law was not going to be useful. They had decided to handle it themselves. Calder Wynn, the outside preacher with no kin in any of the 6 families, had been asked to do the thing nobody local wanted on their conscience alone. He had agreed. He had also, being a man of paper, written it all down. The foreman had been buried under what was then a half-built smokehouse. The smokehouse had been finished over him. The holler had told the timber company that their foreman had wandered off drunk and fallen in the river. Nobody had looked very hard. The trouble had ended. The preacher had stayed and married a Coombs girl and become the unofficial keeper of the ledger. That was the first body. There were others. Maeve, sitting on the bottom step with her mother's lifetime of journals stacked around her ankles, read about a moonshiner from Tennessee in 1958 who had tried to muscle in. A traveling salesman in 1971 who had been seen leaving a bruise on a Renfro wife. A meth cook in 1994 who had set up in the woods behind the church and would not be talked out of it. The holler had a way of dealing with men who hurt its women and men who threatened its quiet. The way involved the smokehouse floor. The names were on the lists. The dates were beside them. The journals named who had been at the meeting and who had cast the deciding vote and who had carried the shovel. The ledger was, Maeve understood with a kind of cold clarity, the only thing keeping any of those men honest with each other. Whoever held the journals held all of their necks at once. Her grandmother had held them. Her mother had held them. Her mother had been begging her daughter, with her last breath, to set the ledger on fire and salt the ground because she did not want her daughter to carry that weight. But the sentence in her grandmother's hand kept pulling Maeve's eyes back. The girl is not Eldon's. The girl is his. Maeve flipped pages. She flipped years. She found her own birth year. She found the entry. The entry was 3 lines long. It said that Hester Holloway had been 17 years old. It said that Eldon Holloway had been 26 and had been away in the army for 14 months. It said that the man whose name was on the first page of the 1947 journal, the circuit preacher Calder Wynn, then 48 years old and married to a Coombs, had been seen leaving the Holloway porch at sunrise 3 different times that winter. It said the child had been born exactly 9 months later. It said the child had her father's eyes. The child, of course, was Maeve. Her father, of course, was not the tall, hard man who had thrown her suitcase into the gravel. Her father was a circuit preacher from West Virginia who had stayed in the holler and been the holler's quiet executioner for the better part of 50 years. Maeve sat very still. She thought about the man she had been raised by, who had hated her quietly her whole childhood and who had thrown her out at 19 for refusing the neighbor's son. She thought about how a man might hate a child who was not his and whose existence was a public secret. She thought about Asa Renfro on the porch, being very careful with his sentences. She thought then, with a small electric shock, about the light she had seen on up the ridge as she came down the cellar stairs. She closed the journal. She stood up. She listened. Above her through the open trapdoor, she heard the soft sound of boots on dirt. More than one pair. She heard the smokehouse door, which she had left half open, swing slowly inward. A man's voice, low and almost kind, called down the stairs. "Maeve, come on up out of there, honey. Let's talk." It was Asa Renfro. Maeve did not move. The voice came again. "We don't want to hurt you, child. We knew Hester would never burn it. We knew she would tell you to. We have been getting ready for tonight for a long time. Come on up." Maeve looked down at her hands. They were not shaking. That surprised her. She looked at the stack of journals at her feet. She looked at the gas can she had set just inside the smokehouse door, 2 steps above her. She thought very clearly that the holler had made a mistake. They had assumed all these years that Hester Holloway's daughter was Hester Holloway's problem. They had not understood that the daughter had spent 23 years learning, in courtrooms, how a paper trail outlasts every man who is afraid of it. Maeve picked up the 1947 journal. She picked up the journal of the year of her own birth. She unbuttoned her coat and slid both books inside, against her ribs. She buttoned the coat again. Then she answered, "I'm coming up, Asa. Hold on. Don't crowd the door." She climbed the stairs slowly. At the top she did not step out. She stood on the second to top step, her head just below the level of the floor, and she looked out across the dirt at the men who had come for her. There were 4 of them. Asa Renfro. 2 younger men she half recognized from childhood, Renfro cousins. And standing a little apart, an old man in a black coat with white hair and a long, kind, exhausted face. The face was the face she had seen, just once, in a faded photograph in her grandmother's Bible when she was 8 years old. Calder Wynne. Her father. He was looking at her the way a man looks at a building that is about to fall. Asa Renfro held out a hand. He said sweetly, "Hester wanted this done a certain way. Let's do it her way. We'll help you. We'll burn the place down, and you can be on the road by sunup, and nobody ever has to know any of this." Maeve on the second to top step said, "I have been on the road since I was 19, Asa. You don't have to put me there." She reached behind her without looking, and her hand found the gas can. She lifted it up out of the cellar and set it on the smokehouse floor at the men's feet. They did not move. They were waiting for her to come up. She did not. She said, "There is a body under this floor. There are dozens of names in those books. Some of you are in those books. Some of your fathers are in those books. My grandfather is in those books. The man who raised me is in those books. The man who fathered me is standing right there." She nodded at Calder Wynne. He closed his eyes for a moment. Asa Renfro's hand dropped to his side. Maeve said, "I am going to walk out of here now. I am going to walk to my car. I am going to drive out of this holler. The journals you can see are staying in the cellar. The journals you can't see are coming with me. If any of you so much as scratch my paint on the way out, copies of those 2 books in my coat right now are going to a federal prosecutor I have known for 11 years. She paused. She added more quietly, "Mama wanted these books gone because she was afraid for me. She was right to be afraid. But she was wrong about how to keep me safe. The way to keep me safe is for every man in this holler to know that I am the one holding the leash now. Not the smokehouse. Me." The 4 men stood in the dim smokehouse. None of them spoke. Calder Wynne opened his eyes. He looked at his daughter for the first and last time in his life. He said in a voice like dry leaves, "Your mother loved you, Maeve. I want you to know that. I should have. I didn't know how." Maeve on the second to top step said, "I know." She climbed up out of the cellar. She walked between them. They parted for her without a word. She stepped out into the yard. The crickets had started up again. The whippoorwill far off was calling. The dirt under her shoes was the same dirt she had walked across at 19, with a suitcase in her hand, and her father's belt still ringing in her ears. She walked to her car. She got in. She started the engine. She drove out of the holler in the gray hour before sunrise. In the rearview mirror, The smokehouse was still standing. She did not burn it. She did not have to. The four men in the doorway did not burn it either. They stood in it for a long time after her taillights were gone. Then Asa Renfro closed the trapdoor and put the rug back over it and locked the padlock and walked home in the dawn. Calder Wynne went home and sat at his kitchen table and watched the sun come up through his window. He did not eat. He did not sleep. He died 9 months later of nothing in particular, the way old men sometimes do when they finally let themselves. Maeve drove 300 miles back to her small city. She made a pot of coffee. This time she drank it. She sat at her kitchen table with the 2 journals in front of her and a yellow legal pad to one side. She did not call the federal prosecutor. She had bluffed about the prosecutor. She did not need him. The threat had been the thing. The threat was now a permanent fixture in the holler, the way the smokehouse itself had once been. She wrote a single letter, in her own careful paralegal hand, and made 6 photocopies. The letter explained, in plain English, that copies of certain pages were now lodged with 3 separate attorneys in 3 separate states, and would be released automatically if any harm came to her or to anyone she named. She named no one she loved, because she had no one left there to love. She named only herself. She mailed 1 copy to Asa Renfro. She mailed nothing to Calder Wynne. He had not asked for anything from her, and she did not owe him a letter. The other 5 copies she kept in a fireproof box in the bottom drawer of her desk, behind the tax returns. Once a year, on the anniversary of her mother's death, she sends a fresh copy to whichever Renfro or Coombs or Wynne currently holds the title to the Holloway farm, just to remind them she is still alive and still paying attention. She never signs her name on the envelope. She never has to. The handwriting on the address line is the same careful schoolteacher hand her grandmother used, the hand Maeve learned by tracing her grandmother's old Christmas cards by lamplight when she was small. Every man in the holler knows that hand by now. Every man in the holler knows what arriving in the mailbox means. The smokehouse still stands. The padlock is still new. The ledger is still in the cellar, minus 2 books. Nobody adds to it anymore. The young men of the holler do not even know it is there. They walk past the squat black building on their way to the woods to hunt deer, and they think nothing of it. The padlock they assume is for tools. The braided rug, they would assume, if they ever went inside, is for the cold. They will never go inside. The key, in their grandmother's tellings, has been lost. The men who used to add to it are old now or dead. The trouble at the orchard, whenever it comes again, is handled the way trouble is handled everywhere else in the country these days, by sheriffs and by lawyers and by the slow, indifferent grinding of the law. The holler has become, without quite noticing, an ordinary place. Maeve Holloway is 65 years old now. She lives alone. She has a small garden. She has a gray cat. On the wall above her desk hangs 1 framed photograph, taken with an old box camera in the summer of 1946. In the photograph, a young circuit preacher in a white shirt stands on a tent pole and laughs at something out of frame. Beside the photograph hangs another frame, this one empty. The empty frame is where Maeve keeps the promise she made to her dying mother. Burn the smokehouse before sunrise. Do not look inside. Do not read anything you find. She kept none of it. She kept herself instead. Some nights when the wind is right and the city is quiet, she thinks she can almost smell cedar and old paper and the faint chemical bite of darkroom fixer drifting in from somewhere far to the east, and she sits very still in the dark, and she lets herself remember that she is, after everything, the daughter of 2 liars and 1 survivor, and that the survivor in the end was her mother, and that the survivor in the end was also her.